Okay, well, the first announcement of the day is, no, I haven't looked at the exam papers yet. Second announcement is, no, I don't know when I'm going to do it. Third announcement is, there's no third announcement. Oh, well. Oh, yes, there is a third announcement, and that is that I'll probably be stopping about 10 minutes short, I think. Partly because I'm giving you a lot of visual stimulus today. Something like 60 slides, including naked bottoms of men. Put on for you, yeah. Partly because it's, I'm going to be talking basically a lot about the Hadrian's Villa at Tivoli. Partly because I can't really start talking about the rest of Hadrianic architecture after this. So I might be finishing a bit early, but we will see, we will see. Well, our story really starts in the year 114, which is when Trajan left Rome for a war against the Parthians. The Parthians were the people who controlled roughly modern Iraq and Iran. And they were always a traditional enemy of Rome. Quite why Trajan decided on this war, nobody really knows. Many said it was simply because he wanted military glory. He wanted to be like Alexander the Great. Remember, Alexander the Great got as far as modern India. No other general of the classical period was that successful. The other thing is, of course, the Parthians were long the traditional enemy of the Roman people. Remember the Prima Porta statue? The man trying to get the taxi? Augustus, that's right. The breastplate, the cuirass is covered with symbols connected to the Parthian war that Augustus had. The real reason, I suspect, was an economic one. We learn from the writer Pliny the Elder, writing in the Flavian period, that already then there was vast amounts of silver coins going out of the Roman Empire to the east for silk, spices and other things. So I think it's quite possible that Trajan wanted this war against the Parthians to take control of Mesopotamia and the Silk Route. Either way, the campaign began quite well. Trajan created 2 or 3 new provinces in the area, but there in the year 116, 2 things happened. One was that the Parthians started rebelling against the Romans in what was supposed to be peaceful areas. Doesn't this sound a familiar story? You know, somebody takes over a large chunk of territory in the Middle East and suddenly the local people object to it. The other reason is there was a Jewish rebellion at this time, a pretty major Jewish rebellion. We know that in 116, Trajan became seriously ill, and in 117 he decided to return to Rome to recover from this, but he died at a place called Selinus, which is modern Gazi Pasha, on the south coast of Turkey, not far from Antalya. He died in August 117. He had no children, but his wife, Plotina, arranged with his closest relative, male relative, Hadrian, that Hadrian should become emperor. Well, this is Hadrian. Hadrian, one of the 2 Spanish emperors, both Trajan and Hadrian of Spanish background, although all Roman citizens, of course, becomes emperor in 117, lives to 138. This is quite a late portrait of the Emperor Hadrian. He was distantly related to Trajan. I think their great-grandfathers were cousins or something like that. But what really helped him become emperor was quite simply that in 117 he was in charge of all the Roman armies in Syria and in Mesopotamia. How did Vespasian take power? He commanded all the armies in Syria, Judea, and so forth. So here we are, Hadrian as Imperator. This is a beautiful, almost life-size bronze statue. It shows a scene from classical warfare on it, which was found in Jerusalem. sometime in the 1970s. A marvellous piece of work, that. Well, Hadrian is accepted as emperor, and he makes his way back to Rome via Ankara. There is an inscription from Ankara sort of saying that so-and-so welcomes the emperor and provides his army with oil. And we have a copy of a letter written by the Emperor Hadrian from a place halfway between here and what was then Byzantium, Constantinople, Istanbul. So he definitely made his way through Ankara. When he got back to Rome, he stresses his loyalty and his blood link to Trajan in as many ways as he can do. One of them is to complete work on Trajan's arch at Beneventum. We see from the inscription on this that Trajan was dead by the time the arch was completed, although the arch does commemorate lots of things to do with Trajan. We know, or we think we know, that Trajan planned to build a temple at the end of the Forum complex. If he did, this would have been dedicated probably to Victoria or possibly to Mars. But we do know that a temple was built here and dedicated to the deified Trajan by the Emperor Hadrian. It's stressing loyalty in relationship to your predecessor. A very important thing in Roman tradition. He may have been responsible for putting the carvings on Trajan's column. There is a lot of argument about this, which I won't go into detail, but there is just that possibility. Well, the evidence is that the Roman people, at any rate, welcomed Hadrian as their new emperor, but he wasn't exactly popular with some of the older members of the Roman Senate. This is quite possibly because the older members thought he was too young, he didn't have enough military experience, they may have hoped that it might be a selection process, rather like Nerva. Remember, Nerva was selected by the Senate to be a fill-in, a stopgap emperor. When he died, people would arrange it so that somebody else would take over from him. But it's quite clear that some members of the Roman Senate, the older members, certainly did not like Trajan at all. One of the things they really didn't like about him was his fondness for everything Greek. He was what we would call a Hellenophile, a lover of all things belonging to the Hellenes, which is the Greeks' own word for themselves. His nickname behind his back was Graeculus, the little Greek. It was said that he actually spoke Greek better than Latin. Well, obviously we don't know the truth of that or not. So that was one thing that wasn't really in his favour. What didn't help was that he was known to be a homosexual. Well, homosexuality was kind of, well, don't ask, don't tell in the Roman world. It was accepted as a phase that young men would go through in their youth, but it wasn't supposed to continue later on in life. So don't ask, don't tell. But the real problem here was that in about 120 or so, 125 or so, Hadrian became basically what was an open public affair with this young man here called Antoninus of Claudiopolis. Any idea where Claudiopolis is? Anybody from Istanbul? You go past Claudiopolis every time you go between here and Istanbul. Any place name in Turkey, like Bolu, comes from the Greek polis. Bolu is where Antoninus comes from. So you can't see much of Claudiopolis. But anyway, this is a rather open public affair in many ways. So this is something else that the Roman people didn't like. Added to all of this, Hadrian wore a beard. Well, there's nothing wrong with beards. Lots of us have beards. We don't know why Hadrian had a beard. Some people think it was because he had a facial scar of some kind. Other people think it's connected to him being a Hellenophile, that he wanted to look more like a Greek philosopher. In fact, there was a very popular joke that went around Rome about the time of Hadrian, but Hadrian never heard it. One philosopher saying that, well, if a beard makes you a good philosopher, then the goat in my backyard is one of the brightest philosophers out. He's got the longest beard. But it sets a fashion amongst Roman people. We see soldiers on Trajan's column with beards as well, so this is why we can't be certain exactly when. But he's the first emperor to wear a beard. The emperors after him all have beards until Constantine. Beards were regarded in upper-class Roman society as a sign, something you only had a beard when you were in mourning for somebody who died. Well, for his own part, Hadrian was definitely a rather complex and moody individual. On the one hand, we can look at his reign and see that he had a deep appreciation and interest in architecture and the visual arts. We can look at the buildings from Hadrian's time. They're absolutely incredible. But on the other hand, he had rather irrational behaviour at some points. We know that soon after getting back to Rome in 117, 118, he ordered the execution of 4 of Rome's leading senators. This may have been because he was worried they might be plotting against him. It might have been simply he didn't like them. We do know that he ordered the execution of Apollodorus, Trajan's chief architect. Well, the reason for that, I'll come back to a little bit later, but it's all connected with Hadrian's known interest in architecture. Hadrian's known interest in architecture, I'll mention a little bit about that today, but I'll also talk about it in the next class. Apollodorus was basically killed, we think, because he made fun of Hadrian. We also have a wonderful quote from a famous philosopher of the time who, on being criticised after agreeing that the Emperor Hadrian in a debate was absolutely right, the philosopher's friend said, "You know he was wrong." And the philosopher said, "You don't argue with the man who's got 150,000 soldiers." Right? So, I mean, yeah, Hadrian was a little bit funny in many ways. All the indications are that Hadrian was a little bit paranoid. People didn't like him, that they were always trying to kill him. Well, I'm not surprised if you go around killing other people just because they make fun of you. But anyway, he probably was a bit paranoid, and this may be the main reason why he decides not to live in Rome at the Domus Augustiana, but to build a new residence in the countryside at a place called Tivoli, about 20 kilometres from Rome. Technically, the name of this place is Hadrian's Villa. Well, a villa is any name that you give to a country house, a country farm. It's technically a working farm. This is a view looking over the site of Hadrian's Villa from modern Tivoli, just to give you some idea of the sloping nature of the landscape there. But this villa was anything but a villa. It was a miniature city in every possible way. This map is actually rather incomplete, but this shows you the main part of it. It's a complex covering 1.3 by 1 kilometre from one end to the other. The map's upside down in the sense that north is down there. It's got everything. It's got a series of private and state apartments. It's got public guest rooms. It's got the emperor's sleeping residences in this particular area here. It's got water features. It's got a gladiators arena down here. Houses for servants, houses for the Praetorian Guard and things like that. It really is a miniature city in many ways. What's interesting about this is the remarkable combination of architecture we get here. Some buildings are purely practical, but some buildings you can call them, in a sense, fantasy buildings. Now, I could easily give you a whole hour on Tivoli, so I'm just giving you the highlights of Tivoli. What we see here, though, is that this is architecture for which we're pretty certain Hadrian actually played a personal part in designing. And I'll come to the evidence for that later. Well, the basic construction material is opus reticulatum. But what we see in Hadrian's villa at Tivoli are developments of existing forms of architecture and a completely new type of architecture being used, an architectural building technique. So, for example, we find extensive use of the groin vault. Now, the groin vault is basically two barrel vaults that meet at right angles. You can call it a cross vault if you like. It's what we've already seen in Trajan's markets at Rome. It's basically two barrel vaults coming in from one side to another. But Trajan's markets, which seem to be the earliest example of the groin vault in actual use, show it as you normally see it, to cover a long space in place of a barrel vault. But what we find in Hadrian's villa is some open spaces being covered with the traditional dome, circular room here in the great baths, so you've got the dome and you've got the oculus at the top. I've got this slide back to front, that's the other side of this. But we also see groin vaults coming up like this. So it's a development, it's one more stage along from Trajan's idea of vaulting at the aula. It's improving the technology. It's making the technology more common, it's showing a greater use in it. You can see how the vaults spring out like that, a series of cross vaults like that. Here we have the actual spring in. And another interesting feature about this is the use of tiles set into the concrete like that. It seems to be to hold in place stucco work. You still have quite a lot of surviving stucco work in this particular structure here. But in addition to the standard dome, I mean by this time the dome's a pretty easy architectural feature. We see it appearing in Nero's Domus Aurea, we see it in Domus Transitorium, we've got much earlier examples down in Campania, so the dome is nothing fantastic by this particular point. But the groin vault, that is a development of an existing idea to cover a square space with a cross vault like that. But then we have this, the ribbed vault or the ribbed dome. This is a developed version of the groin vault in which you've actually got 8 ribs. Now if you look at this, you can see you've got 2 going like that, 2 going like that, 2 going like that, and 2 going like that. It gives you that beautiful octagonal feature at the centre there. It looks, when you look inside one of these, like a pumpkin in reverse, which is why it's sometimes known as a pumpkin vault, or like an inside of an umbrella. So it's sometimes known as an umbrella vault or umbrella dome. Is this important? Yes. Every Byzantine church you see with a dome on it basically has got this type of dome. The earliest examples we have, Hadrian's villa at Tivoli. We find it at Tivoli used in the Piazza di Oro, the golden place, which is this complex down here. It seems to be some form of official state complex. It's a beautiful garden complex, this wonderful series of colonnaded rooms round the back here with a view out to either side. Lovely garden coming in here. But this is the thing I wanted to look at, the vestibule here. The vestibule, as you can see, is basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, an octagonal structure. It's a square, if you like, with projection to either side. It doesn't look particularly impressive from the outside, but when you look inside it, you can just about see, and I apologise for the quality, the sun's never in the right place, the beginning of this. Here we have it. This is a ribbed pumpkin umbrella dome, and you can see the springing coming out like that. You can see how it's related to the groin vault, quite clearly related to this. Now, the really interesting thing about this and it wasn't worked out until only about 20 years ago, is that there's a very puzzling passage in Roman history, in a later history of Hadrian, which says that the reason why Apollodorus was executed was because Hadrian came running up to him when Trajan was still alive with some architectural drawings. He asked Apollodorus for his opinion of these, and Apollodorus said, "Go away and play with your pumpkins." And nobody ever made the connection for a long, long time that, pumpkin vault. So it's possible, I'm not saying that Hadrian actually came up with the idea of the pumpkin vault, but there's a connection there. Well, if Hadrian is responsible for coming up with design elements like this, then we can see that Hadrian could be interested in the whole design of this complex. And in fact, when we look at other pieces of Hadrianic architecture in the next class, you'll see that Hadrian was very much a hands-on person in that particular respect. Hadrian's villa at Tivoli, as I said, covers an area roughly 1.5 by 1 kilometres total extent. It goes much further down here. It goes from uphill on the south side, going downhill on the north side. And you've got this wonderful series of buildings that don't look as if they're connected in many ways. You know, everything seems to be on different angles. That doesn't quite line up with that. This doesn't line up with that. Funny cross-shaped building there, circular buildings there. The actual design is a very clever use of the topography. You can see the contour lines. So wherever possible, what the designer of this did was to fit in discrete groups of buildings where he could, keeping them as symmetrical as he possibly could, and building little bits in between to make the connection, so that you can go from here through there like that. You don't really notice you're going through a whole series of strange bits and pieces. It took about 10 years to complete, possibly a bit longer. And because it's cut into the hillside, there's an enormous amount of terracing involved in this. Fortunately for archaeologists, bricks were stamped with the year they were made when Hadrian was emperor. Now, Hadrian was often out of Italy, and we could actually follow the course of the work. We can see, for example, suddenly there's a great increase in buildings that have brick stamps for the year 125. 125 was the year Hadrian was coming back from Asia Minor. You know, you can actually follow this in many ways. A very remarkable thing about this, a whole series of really dramatic water features, which again make use of a natural supply of water coming down here. Again, just a general view, looking over it. You can't really see the remains of the villa, but going down the hill like that. Well, what do we have here? Well, we do have a series of structures which have got names to them. For example, the Puicili. We know from the literature that owners of villas, wealthy Romans, would name parts of their private house after places they were particularly fond of, after places they were interested in. The Puicili gets its name from the Stoa Puicili, which is the place where Plato came out with his philosophy in Athens, the painted Stoa. It's possible that this was actually designed as a sort of after-dinner walk-in space for people to engage in philosophical discussion. Well, of course, we don't have the colonnades going around anymore, but it's basically just this enormous water pool right at the, not quite at the bottom of the whole complex, which originally would have looked something like this. Colonnades all the way around it, a sheltered garden area. Puicile suggests it's somehow connected to philosophy. It doesn't have to be directly, but it may very well be. This modern model gives you some idea of what it would have looked like originally. So the Stoa Puicili is one particular part of the villa which has a name, but we also have this. This is a really exciting part. It's called the Canopus. The Canopus is the name of a city on the western branch of the Nile Delta, connected by a canal to Alexandria, if I remember rightly. So this gets its name from a feature in Egypt. What is the Canopus? Well, again, it's another wonderful water feature, but not a simple, straightforward one. It's fantasy architecture, luxury architecture, relaxing architecture, if you like. I've got lots of money, I'm going to build whatever I want all over the place. You've basically got this very large open pool here. You can see the size of it roughly there. At one end, you've got a triclinium, a covered dining area, which is decorated to make it look like a grotto, a cave. And it actually has running water going all the way through it into a fountain there. This is incredibly well decorated. You get some idea of the size of it from here. I know there's nobody standing in that particular photograph, but there's a duck floating on the Canopus there. But this is the fountain area coming in. It goes down into this half-dome structure, the triclinium here, where you've got a lovely little step fountain at the back there. And that's surrounded by a dining bench with, again, running water in front, and a little fish pond in the front there. And you can see a large piece of the dome has actually fallen down there. To emphasize the Egyptian connection with the Canopus, with Egypt, it's actually decorated, of course, in many ways with Egyptian features. Well, this is purely Roman, this use of an arcade with the lintels going in between it. We'll come back to these statues in a moment. But you've got all these wonderful little crocodile statues. Now, who can see what is wrong with that crocodile statue? And got a big piece of iron sticking out of his mouth. So many of the statues at Tivoli got stolen that they replaced them with concrete copies. So there you have a concrete crocodile, and you can see his tails going there. But that's an original one. Now in the Vatican Museum. It's not a terribly good representation of a crocodile, so I don't think they actually had one lying around at the time when they made it. There's also a statue of the Nile god on one side. Again, these are all copies, but very good copies. The Nile god who's leaning against the Sphinx, you can just see him there. And to match the Nile god on the other side, you have the Tiber god. Well, gods of rivers are usually shown like this, you know, big rivers, sort of bearded men, that sort of thing. You can see this is the Tiber god because you've got Lupa and the two twins down there. This is actually the original. This is in the museum. The funny thing is that sometime in the medieval period, somebody went up to Tivoli and got a lot of the statues, piled them together to burn them, to make lime out of these. But somehow they never got around to doing it, so the statues have survived. What is interesting is the use of different types of marble involved here. Now, these are actually made of Parian marble from the island of Paros, which was one of the more expensive marbles available in the Roman period. Then, possibly on both sides of the Canopus, we're not quite certain about this, were a series of these figures, the caryatids. You can call them Atlantids or Telemon figures. The male ones, the Telemons, are Atlantid figures. Well, the caryatids are direct copies of the one used at the Erechtheion in Athens. Remember, this is Hadrian Graeculus, Hadrian who likes things Greek. Stoa Poikile, philosophical walkabout place, caryatid figures that you have here. But its interest in all things Greek also extends to the decoration, the statues that originally stood around the Canopus. So we have, for example, this wounded Amazon statue, which is a copy of a classical Greek statue made by Phidias to decorate the Artemision at Ephesus. Now, the original is gone, but we have descriptions of it, so we can recognise what this is, and this is the most complete copy that we have, so we can actually get some idea of what the original work looked like. There's also another wounded Amazon. It's a copy after Polyclitus, and you can just see her there. And then we have Ares or Hermes. It's clearly a copy of a classical Greek sculpture. We don't know who made the original, but there's no doubt about its inspiration. Hadrian, Graeculus. He likes all things Greek. He likes to have his private little home surrounded with as many Greek-type objects as possible. There's a third water feature in the whole complex, which is also a fascinating piece of architecture. And again, one suspects Hadrian's personal involvement in the design here, because it's bringing in new design features that we haven't really seen before in Roman architecture. I mean, in the Piazza di Oro, you've got all these wonderful curving spaces here, but here at the so-called Island Villa or the Maritime Theatre, you've got a remarkable small structure, but absolutely really impressive in many ways. Well, the purpose of this is basically to give the emperor private space. You've got this high circular wall, entered through a guard post here, originally with a wooden movable bridge over this water feature here. That can be taken up. Once the emperor's there, he can have his own little party, do what he wants. There's a triclinium there, a dining room, there's bedrooms there, there's even a small bathhouse there as well. But look at this amazing concentration on curved shapes, groin vaults all over the place. It really is something where, you get this idea that the emperor is personally involved in the design of this. There's nothing really like this in architecture before the time of Hadrian. You've got hints of it in the Domus Aurea. You've got a little bit more of a hint in the Domus Augustiana, but here in the Piazza di Oro and the Maritime Theatre, it's going absolutely wild with all these sort of circular spaces. You've got this colonnade going around it in the Ionic order, and you can see Opus Verticulatum used all the way through. Opus Tessalium, brickwork actually used for the structure itself. I don't know why I put that one back on. Oh yeah, looking down on it again. Again, just to emphasize, all the curves which are involved in here. Reverse curves, positive curves, and so forth. Everything an emperor needs to get away from it. I mean, yeah, you can get away from everything on that particular one. Well, Hadrian's Villa at Tivoli has got some wonderful pieces of architectural development in it, architectural interest in it. And as you can imagine, a home for an emperor, it's also got some incredible decoration. We've already seen some copies of classical Greek works. There are original versions of late Republican sculpture in the villa. I showed you a black and white version of this, the Tivoli General. There you've got the sort of old general's head on the young man's body. That was actually found at this particular place. We've got statues which may be originals or they may be copies of classical Greek works. So for example, you've got these two, the old and the young centaur. They're made of a red marble. It doesn't really come out terribly well in this photograph. Centaur, of course, like this, a human front part, the body of a horse like that. Nobody's been able to find a classical source that mentions these two, so we don't really know whether they're based on classical Greek works or not. But they are in that Hellenistic Baroque style. Remember the head of Odysseus? Yeah, oh, that was in the exam. Yes, I remember now. It's the same sort of classical Baroque style that you've got there. You've got this wonderful example, the red fawn. Now, most of this is actually, not most of it, a lot of this has been restored in the 18th century. You can see sort of where the join marks are, because some of these statues had been broken up for reuse elsewhere. So his arm's been completely restored there, his right arm. Again, it's a classical work. Is it an original? Probably not. Use of red stone, use of a red marble, that's more of a Roman feature. And I should have really said that about the centaurs. But if it's copying an original, we don't know what it is. But then we have this whole series of other copies of classical sculptures. Some of these are in Parian marble, some are in Pentelic marble. Pentelic marble is from just north of Athens, and some is Docimaeum marble near Afyon, Kara-Hizar. So, you know, different types of marble being used here. This one, Diana the Huntress, copy after Learches. Again, we've got descriptions of the original work, so we can actually see, identify it is and say what they are. The private parts, the state parts, if you like, of the whole complex, many areas had floors of opus sectile. Opus sectile is the method of flooring using different coloured marbles, like this, to create a very pleasing pattern. These are fairly straightforward marbles here. That's African yellow marble, that's yellow Antico marble there. This is the green porphyry, probably from Greece. I'm not certain where the red one is. There's heavily grained marble here. This is actually from what is now Turkey, modern Turkey. The same with that there. Again, more African marble. But let's just look at this one. This is really extravagant. The purple is from Egypt. That's imperial porphyry marble. This is green porphyry marble from Greece. And again, you see, with all these really expensive stones, no expense is spared on building this particular place. In the more public areas, for example, in the guest room areas, servants' areas, black and white mosaics. This isn't cheapness. For those of you who think that, oh, a black and white mosaic, oh, well, must be cheaper than making a polychrome one. As Serdal knows, black and white mosaic tradition continued in Italy, was very popular in Italy, starts off in the 1st century BC, carries right through to the middle of the 3rd century BC. Polychrome, coloured mosaics don't start becoming popular in Italy until the time of Hadrian, the Antonine period, going into the 2nd century. So this Italian black and white marble mosaic tradition isn't a sign of cheapness, but it's a beautiful piece of mosaic work there. And another close detail there, sort of showing you just how beautifully airy it is. The most famous of the mosaics from Hadrian's villa at Tivoli is this. It's a small mosaic panel, about 40 centimetres by 40 centimetres. That's the modern surround. This is the part we're interested in. We know from Pliny the Elder, who was writing under Vespasian, that in his time there was one very, very famous mosaic artist, Sosus of Pergamon, who lived 150 to 100 BC or thereabouts. He was famous for making two particular types of mosaic. One of these is the Drinking Doves mosaic. Now this is actually a mosaic panel that was made in a workshop on a terracotta backing or a marble backing, so it could be taken and put into place on the floor itself. This is so close. It's a very good piece of work, but this seems to be so close to the original. Some people think it might actually be the original by Sosus, but there is general agreement that this is a Hellenistic product. So it was already 200 years old when it was built into Hadrian's villa. It was handed down one to the other. There's also this very remarkable mosaic panel, the Battle of the Centaurs and the Wild Animals. Here you see the one male centaur, his female centaur down there, with a very realistic tiger, a lion, and a panther up there. What was the name of the bloke who wrote the Tarzan novels? Was it Burroughs? Anyway, he got it all wrong because he had Tarzan sort of playing about with tigers and lions. You don't find tigers and lions in the same part of the world. And there's a bit of an elementary mistake with this, obviously, because you've got a tiger and a lion here. So Hadrian's Villa at Tivoli really being, the most wonderful piece of work by the emperor, full of wonderful artworks, and we'll stop at that particular point there, which I think is just nice and early. He became seriously ill, and in 117 he decided to return to Rome to recover from this, but he died at a place called Selinus, which is modern Gazi in the south coast of Turkey, and not far from Antalya. He died in August 117. He had no children, but his wife, Plotina, arranged with his closest relative, male relative, Hadrian, that Hadrian should become emperor. Well, it's just Hadrian. Hadrian, one of the two Spanish emperors, both Trajan and Hadrian of Spanish background, although all Roman citizens, of course, becomes emperor in 117, lives to 138. This is quite a late portrait of the of men. But on for you, yeah. Partly because it's, I'm going to be talking basically a lot about the Hadrian's Villa at Tivoli. Partly because I can't really start talking about the rest of Hadrianic architecture after this. So I might be finishing a bit early, but we will see, we will see. Well, our story really starts in the year 114, which is when Trajan left Rome for a war against the Parthians. The Parthians were the people who controlled roughly modern Iraq and Iran. And they were always a traditional enemy of Rome. Quite why Trajan decided on this war, nobody really knows. Many said it was simply because he wanted military going out of the Roman Empire to the east for silk, spices and other things. So I think it's quite possible that Trajan wanted this war against the Parthians to take control of Mesopotamia and the Silk Route. Either way, the campaign began quite well. Trajan created 2 or 3 new provinces in the area, but there in the year 116, 2 things happened. One was that the Parthians started rebelling against the Romans in what was supposed to be peaceful areas. Doesn't this sound a familiar story? You know, somebody takes over a large chunk of territory in the Middle East and suddenly the local people object to it. The other reason is there was a Jewish rebellion at this time, a pretty major Jewish rebellion. We know that in 116, Trajan began. Okay, well, the first announcement of the day is, no, I haven't looked at the exam papers yet. Second announcement is, no, I don't know when I'm going to do it. Third announcement is, there's no third announcement. Oh, well. Oh, yes, there is a third announcement, and that is that I'll probably be stopping about 10 minutes short, I think. Partly because I'm giving you a lot of visual stimulus today. Something like 60 slides, including naked bottoms for glory. He wanted to be like Alexander the Great. Remember, Alexander the Great got as far as modern India. No other general of the classical period was that successful. The other thing is, of course, the Parthians were long the traditional enemy of the Roman people. Remember the Prima Porta statue? The man trying to get the taxi? Augustus, that's right. The breastplate, the cuirass is covered with symbols connected to the Parthian war that Augustus had. The real reason, I suspect, was an economic one. We learn from the writer Pliny the Elder, writing in the Flavian period, that already then there was vast amounts of silver coins